Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, bots and cons, to Tech Talk, the officially unofficial Transformers TCG podcast. We have a little bit of a switch for you this week as we're bringing you the second half of our most recent recording first. The reason being is we want to keep everything on topic. So if you want to reference it, there are 2 articles produced by Scott over on vectorsigma.info, which also go into detail regarding this episode's topic. Enjoy. You ready to move into, I guess, our more complex one, Scott?
Mentally, maybe not digitally or technology-wise, but yeah.
Okay, so let me set the stage a little bit. As of this recording, both pieces of your initial dissertation are actively on the site, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so for those who have not had the chance to read it, definitely you want to head over to vectorsigma.info and read Scott's 2 articles on spheres. Why are we talking about 3D balls? Because, well, it seems to be the seminal work for you, Scott, for Transformers. And once you started explaining it to me as well as other team members, it felt very natural. Like, well, yeah, I guess that is how I was mentally viewing things, but didn't really think about it or really articulate it. And it just, you were telling me, it was one of those moments you were telling it to me and I'm envisioning it and it was clicking immediately for the most part. Obviously, it's a very complex thing and we're going to try and explain part of it. But let's start with the goal, Scott. What was the point of this? Why are we talking about this and why do people care?
I think people should care because the options in this game are numerous as to what decks and what character lineups to play. Although, to be honest with you, I was thinking about the other day that the battle decks don't differ all that much. It's really the character lineups that tend to differ more.
Right.
With some battle card choices that are changed as a result of the character lineup you're using, but let's just say it's like 30 out of 40 of your cards are similar.
Right.
So because of that, there had to be a way of describing the different types of decks, and people are asking all the time to what's a tier deck, what's a tier 1 deck, what's a tier 2 deck. Like, the only way to actually arrive at that is to figure out what beats what, how often what beats what, and all that. And the only way to really do that is with something we mentioned earlier with tournament results or grinding a bunch of games yourself. Mm-hmm. But there should be a way, usually, I mean, based on a card pool, in other games I've played and in general, you should be able to define, X should be able to beat Y for Z reason. And that will help you shortcut everything we just mentioned about grinding a bunch of games or getting a bunch of tournament results that we're not getting. So in order to shortcut that, I wanted to come up with some kind of theory to basically save time and basically either just test bad matchups, just test good matchups slightly to make sure they are still good and immediately say, okay, yes, this worked out the way it was supposed to for XYZ reason. And see if there were consistent reasons, not like, randomization went your way type reasons.
Right.
And then what you could do to improve other matchups. Is there a way to fit yourself within this concept without...
All right, we hit another audio snag here, folks. So again, apologies, but we're going to dive right back in. The shortcuts, and I think it started to go wonky on us when you were describing our good matchups still good as compared to testing all the bad matchups to try and figure out where to go from there. So from what I heard from you, and feel free to repeat any of this, is that the whole purpose for this was to try and save some time. At the end of the day, there should be a level where we can look at 2 decks and say, this is how this matchup should play out, and then make a decision on how you want to influence before you're testing it, as opposed to having to grind 1,000 games to prove that Insecticons beats Dinobots.
Yes, and also I think a corollary to that is I didn't want play skill to come into play for the matchups as well.
Okay.
I wanted the decks on their own to stand for this beats X beats Y for Z reason, and not and figure out if there was a way to basically and to also cut down the number of X decks there even were. That was
Right.
also part of it.
So that explains the history behind it to some extent, as far as why you were trying to come up with this theory and how you kind of went about it. So let's talk about what it actually is, because one of the things I had referenced a moment ago was that according to this chart, you're stating that Insecticons should, barring obviously egregious play errors or some unknown factor in the battle deck, on paper, you should be beating up Dinobots with Insecticons, correct?
Yes.
And the whole point is, and again, feel free to repeat this stuff or elaborate, is that because of the way the characters break down and because of the way those decks break down, that, and you said this in your article, the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock scenario of the way all of these form a matrix between each other.
Yeah. Again, assuming that the decks are built correctly, the characters are being used correctly, and the number of it basically came down to an axis of the number of characters versus the type of deck. That's where the basic axes of the diagram come into play, but it's also where I believe that the separation of a deck style also comes into play. So you have 3 different deck styles in aggro control, and then you have number of characters from technically 1 all the way up to, I guess, 5 at this point. Like I guess you could play 6 4-drops if you want, but like, or
Constructicons.
right. So I just made it at 4+, but because I think the theory holds the same. I haven't seen any differences otherwise, but
right.
I stopped it at 4+. But so to me, you have you put the decks into categories based on that, the number of characters they have and the style of deck that they are, and then you wind up with whatever, a 3x4. So you wind up with 12 different styles that you could possibly be. And I didn't even define all of them because I don't even think all of them technically exist.
Yeah, to this stage, I mean, I'm sure people have played Orange, Optimus, Battlefield Legend, Nemesis, or something like that, but I don't know if that necessarily warrants the space on this already very crowded chart just yet.
Right.
So going forward, obviously you're going to be refining this, and that there's going to be more data as new sets come in, as we were just talking about with the qualifier season, the meta evolves, and obviously there's always that X factor of play skill and, of course, how the deck is actually constructed, as you reference. But the goal being, this is going to be a tool moving forward to say, okay, we have a new meta. What are the axiomatic rules that we know, such as the interaction between 3-wide blue decks and wider blue decks, 4+? Any other thoughts you want to add on there as to like how somebody, because this is a very complex chart, about reading it and understanding the information that you're trying to present?
I mean, the point in the future is to figure out what ways you can do to break the cycle of the arrows.
Right.
So can you change? And I'm not. I mean, obviously, one way would be to wholesalely use. I don't know if that's a word, but I keep using it. To use a deck that's not even represented here, and obviously this is not every deck in the world, but like, are there strategies that would not be represented here that you can change in order to fit a different style or a different number of characters or something like that would help you in certain matchups? I think the answer is likely yes, but I think what you're still going to be exposed to some weakness.
Of course.
I still believe there's no deck that just beats everything. So you're always going to have some type of weakness. It will likely still fit into one of these spheres. It just may have a better matchup against certain other decks within that sphere. I think what's important going forward is to understand why, even if a deck is within the sphere, why it may have a better matchup or a worse matchup against other spheres. Like, why does the Fire Wheels deck, why did that have a better matchup against Optimus Prime, Battlefield Legend, 3-wide control decks than Insecticons did? I mean, the answer is because one of them had RC and one of them didn't.
Right.
But they would still occupy the same space. Like, that deck is technically just an Autobot Insecticon deck.
Yes.
A 4-wide aggro deck in this case. So it still has a lot of the same weaknesses, but it actually didn't have some of the weaknesses to the 3-wide control decks, sort of. And obviously it gets more complicated when you have the ability to sideboard, because, for example, that deck was weaker to when you went 2 tall primes than Insecticons has against 2 tall primes. So not every deck within the sphere is necessarily going to operate 100% like the other ones. That's why, like, the arrows are not, like, set in stone, because there is room within the sphere to adjust your matchups in certain ways. Like, the Blaster deck, for example, does not operate the same way as Insecticons against its certain matchups as well.
Right.
But I believe esoterically, the way that the decks are built, from the aggro control slant and the number of characters, most of the time they will operate close to the same matchups against all the other deck styles, in my opinion.
Right. And to your point, that's the whole goal of setting up the framework for everything with this diagram, with this theory, is that you have to start somewhere, and in order to create Fire Wheels, you kind of have to know that, okay, well, 3-wide performs in this fashion against 4-wide orange decks. I want to play a 4-wide orange deck. How do I combat that? But if you don't have the basic information about the way those matchups play out, or whether it's that matchup or 3-wide aggro, 4-wide aggro, whatever, you don't really have a starting point, and you're just kind of grasping at straws. And it should be influencing both, obviously, your deck decision, but the individual battle card decisions, the character decisions. If you know your local meta and it's rife with 4-wide aggro, well, then that probably tells you which things you want to look at on this chart to try and address those particular issues. And it's going to be important going forward, especially qualifier season, and then looking forward to the Energon Invitational when we get new sets, that we're going to be up against it again, where you have a very short time frame to try and identify a whole lot of information.
Yeah, I think we've touched upon things here. Like, you've said things like, I run my deck against Insecticons a bunch of times to find out how it's doing. And it's like, if you're already behind the 8 ball because you made some 3-wide aggro deck, or you made some 2 tall control deck, or something like that already has, according to something like this, a negative matchup already, like,
right,
what are you really like, why are you getting frustrated? Like, that's going to be your bad matchup anyway.
Exactly. But
I think a lot of players put themselves into that trap and just don't understand that, like, they weren't favored in that matchup to begin with. So you should only be happy when you find a way to be able to solve it, instead of being frustrated that that's just the way the matchup goes.
And there's the underlying current to that is, well, 2 points for it. One is, if you are going in with that assumption that it's a weak matchup, there's your potential meta breaker, as you were alluding to earlier, that, oh, well, I want to test hiding spot or other card or whatever. Does that influence the matchup enough to then push this into an acceptable percentage? So if you're going in with the expectation that you're going to get stomped, and then you're testing to see these other factors, what their influence is, that's one thing. If it's like what you're describing, Scott, that you're just going in and you get frustrated because you get thrashed, you're not helping yourself. You should know going in that it's rough, and that, like you said, you're not going to beat everything.
Yeah, and I think the way the 25-star limit of a deck breaks down, most decks that are created will fall in the middle category. They're falling in the 3-wide XYZ.
Yes.
And so they typically have bad matchups against the decks on the poles. So they have bad matchups against your 5-wide control Aerobots, or your 4-wide aggro Insecticons, or your Blasters, or your Predacons, like your 5-wide aggro decks. So because of the star costs, a lot of people tend to build decks. I'm going to play these 3 characters together. I'm going to play these 3 characters together. And then they go out and they test against these things and they don't win. And it's like, well, this deck just doesn't work. Well,
it doesn't work
it probably
in those matchups.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess the question you then have to ask yourself, and this is part of why I wanted to create this as well, was, so you need to ask yourself, if you didn't improve that matchup, why did you, like, what was the point?
Yeah, what did you expect going in?
Right, like, are you just trying to find the best deck within the sphere? And this was, like, kind of like when it became a sphere concept instead of, like, the continuum concept. Like, are you just trying to find the best, what do they call it, like, I don't know, invent the best, I forget what the term is, like...
I'm not sure what you're looking for.
Like, the best tool to, like, you know, hammer in the same nail or something like that. Like, you're just trying to improve, like... You're just improving something that basically does the same function as something else, which is good, right. But if it doesn't actually help you change anything, did it matter?
Yeah, sometimes, and it's not... And this may be a different point than where you're going with it, but... and feel free to stop me if it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the best improvement to a deck may be just playing another one, because if, to your point, that if you're going in with 3 wide aggro, you're trying to make the best Dinobots. Everybody around you is playing Insecticons. There's only so many options. Your best Dinobot deck may not include Dinobots, and you need to go to another sphere. And that's not and it's something I've struggled with personally, and I've mentioned before, both on other shows and in some of the articles I've written. Because I'm a big Transformers fan, I tend to get attached to specific characters. So I really want to play a deck with character X. But the problem is that, like you said, they tend to group into 3 wide blah. And that may or may not actually be feasible given the other parts. So you have to take a step back and realize at the same time, while it's a Transformers card game, it's also a card game, and the meta also sets its own rules.
Yeah, that article hasn't come out yet, so that's just a preview.
Well, yes, a little bit
about that.
Yeah. But I have brought up a similar point in other conversations with people, that it is, you do need to take these into consideration, that you could bash your head against a wall for a really long time and not make any progress just because of the way that particular matchup plays out. It's not unwinnable 100% of the time. You could know it inside and out and play better than your opponent. But as you were saying earlier, Scott, the whole focus of this is to try and extract the play skill element, because it's such a huge potential variable.
Yeah. And I think part of what's important. So if we assume that the matchups that the arrows are pointing to are correct, then what we're left with is trying to figure out which deck within the sphere is best. That either best exemplifies what that sphere needs to do, i.e., like, win the matchups it should and get as close as possible to not losing the matchups that it should,
right?
To have some chance against them, or find a way that, like, even within it, you can't break the mold, but you at least do better against your own sphere, which means that you're at least eliminating. It's not really 2/3, but let's just call it like 2/3 of what you could face out there,
right?
Because I guess ultimately, if I had my druthers, okay, and you can never do this, but you would know exactly what you're going to face when you go into a tournament, what everybody's running,
right?
And you would, and obviously, and like, let's just leave the matchups themselves as random, but you walk in, you know what everybody's playing, so you have perfect information. And again, like, what everyone's playing, the cards in their deck isn't relevant. But let's just say from a stylistic sphere perspective, you knew what everybody was running.
Okay.
So you would then say, like, 10% of the people are running this, 20% of the people are running this, and you would just do the calculation right there and then and say, okay, my best odds of winning this event based on everybody and what they're playing and their style is, I want to play the deck that has the best matchups here, X, Y, Z, and you would just do the math and figure out like what the best option is. But because you don't have that option, you don't know that going in, you need to come up, you need to simulate that as best as possible. The main variable that we never know, again, is what people are going to show up with.
Of course.
And this is probably something that like we overthink at times, to be honest with you.
Probably.
because especially like going into a major event, like the way going into Gen Con, like it was like, and we talked about this, like, we had what we considered to be the metagame, but that wasn't what other people would, and how would that affect things, etc. But because you don't have that perfect information, you need to have some starting point to save time and effort going in. I can give other examples of like where we had decks that we chose not to run at Gen Con because they really didn't operate any differently than other options within that sphere, in my opinion.
Right.
And in fact, I would argue that some decks that were made within certain spheres operated poorer against matchups that they had. And I feel like if you're starting off from that perspective, like you can't veer too much into that territory either, which may be a different topic, but...
Well, could you elaborate on what that territory is, just for people that may not be following?
Sure,
I guess.
And this I understand is something that I didn't have time to go over and plan to in the future, but like, it's going to take multiple outlets to be able to do it. But like,
of course,
if you understand why a certain matchup, from a sphere perspective, so from a matchup style perspective, is in the favor of one deck or the other, there's a reason for it. In this game, a big part of the reason for it is the characters. So we have to start there.
Of course.
So if let's just assume you're running the same character lineup. You're not veering too much from changing the characters. Now what's left is the decisions of your battle deck. But what you need to understand is a lot of the times that those characters were chosen was because of their combat style. So like your ranged melee specialist.
Right.
The specific stats they offer, the specific abilities they offer, etc. And because your battle deck should synergize with that, veering too much away from that and making your good matchup suffer as a result of it is, you can't just rely on, I'm just going to win this matchup because Scott says that this sphere always beats this sphere. Like if you change the deck too much, you'll shift that balance away from where the good matchup is, and I think you can never do that too much, if that makes sense.
Yes, because if I'm following you correctly, again, just to use Insecticons as an example, if you modify that to include a whole bunch of non-orange things, because that was a common trait way back in Wave 1 that a lot of people, and at this point, I think a lot of people have accepted the virtually pure orange version. If you start trying to make that better against some hypothetical matchup that it's currently losing by including a whole bunch of blue stuff, well, now you're giving an opening to the decks that you should be beating, and therefore, kind of to call back to what I was saying earlier, why aren't you just playing something else at that stage? You're no longer playing to the strengths of the characters that you're selecting or the build that you're selecting.
Yes, that is a good example. The Wave 1 Insecticon example is a good example.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind that we had harped on the idea that this is your initial framework to try and establish what do you think everything should, or how should everything work? And then what can I do to break those relationships so that now my 3-wide is beating 4-wide aggro? Okay, well, your 5 percentage point gain in a 70-30 matchup, and I'm just making all this up, so don't quote me on this. But if you're now going, instead of being a 70-30 underdog to now a 65-35 underdog, but then your good matchups that were 70-30 are now 50-50. Is it worth that sort of trade-off? Is it worth trying to improve things when, again, maybe the answer lies in, you got to take a step back and say, maybe it's not this deck's time. It's not that it's bad. It's not that it can never work. It's just, maybe it's not going to work right now for this event that I'm playing in this weekend, sort of thing.
Yes, and I think there is a tendency of players, again. I think, like you said, it's inexperience with card games
Yep.
in general, to think that whatever deck I bring, I'm the favorite to win regardless because of the effort I put in,
Hmm.
or because of XYZ reason, and it's normally the effort I put in or the amount of time that I spend doing this versus my perceived competition and what I perceive their effort and their knowledge to go into it. But like, you can't fight City Hall is my whole point. Is another point of a lot of this.
Hmm.
Like you just cannot get better than a 50-50. Or like, on paper you probably can't get better than a 50-50. Now, can your play skill slant a bad matchup? Originally, this
Of course.
diagram, a lot of the circles overlapped and it was just became too hard to read. But
It was
play
worse than this.
yes.
No, I'm just kidding.
Because, and it was even worse when it was the continuum, because basically,
Yeah.
like you said, like a 70-30 matchup that suddenly became 50-50 because I'm giving you 20% play skill that you understand the matchup better than your opponent. Is that I can't go out and tell a third party person that is correct information because
Right.
you're a better player than them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's not a reasonable assumption to make, nor is it a consistent assumption. It, like, yeah, you might be better than your first round opponent, just to make something up. That doesn't mean your second round opponent who's playing the exact same build it's going to play out the same exact way.
Yeah, and when a third party asks you for advice, you have to step back and be able to give them I guess this is also where I wanted to have a theory. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be able to step back and say, how should this work for everybody? Not just how should this work for me, or how should this work for people I know? Like, is there a way to define the decks themselves and the way that the styles play out against themselves, so that there was a way to level the playing field of play skill out the window? That's not to say that this is really not to say that this doesn't. It matters tremendously. But you have to assume that everyone's on an equal playing field to start, or else like the whole thing it doesn't even matter.
Well, yes, because that again, and you've mentioned it many times before, even on this recording, that play skill is such a massive factor in things that it can shift the relationship between these different builds. But that's a big assumption to try and jump to, especially with a lot of other unknowns.
Yeah. So I needed to have a way to define it equally across the board, and this was what I came up with.
Yeah, I mean, as I started out with this, as you were describing it to me, even before the articles, and we're as a team we're talking about it, the concept makes sense to me, and I think you've articulated it about as well as you possibly can for something. It's one of those things that if you don't quite grasp it, don't feel bad about it. It may just be you got to familiarize yourself with the idea, but I think this is going to be an important tool for all of us going forward, trying to identify how to evaluate certain cards, how to evaluate certain things. And we've mentioned it multiple times here, but also in the past, that nobody has infinite time. You can't possibly test every single scenario and every potential build. So a shortcut of this nature definitely gives you a head start.
Yeah, and I understand that, again, like, there wasn't time to explain the whys of why certain matchups work out the way they do, but I think just the way that the number of games I've played with in this game, and I wish I had more exposure to playing this game from a limited perspective, I think would probably help some of the theories. But, like, you know, when people don't understand why they're losing, like, why is my 3 wide deck losing to, well, random 4 wide Autobot deck, for example, or something like that? Like, what do I do to sideboard differently in this matchup? Like, how many characters should I be sideboarding, etc. Um, it's because literally any vanilla character can go from, let's just say, like, my 3 power 5-drop is probably going to be, whatever, like an 8 or a 9 before flips.
Yeah, they can hit
On
double
any given
digits
turn.
quicker than you might think as well.
Yeah. So, people that make a big deal about characters that are attacking for 17, like, did it really matter when that 5-drop over there just got to 12? Like, that was enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess some of this theory has to be true, because if you notice, like, the hit points of characters has increased in the Siege set, to probably take some of this stuff into consideration, so that, like, again, you can just reckless charge and grenade launcher any character and have them be +8 in any given turn.
Yep.
And I don't mean to give it like an orange slant or something like that. I'm just giving.
Well, it's the most. I think it's the simplest way to illustrate the idea.
Yeah, and I think so. Like, at that point, any character is probably, like, you play those 2 cards and you do your flips, you're probably at like +10 guaranteed. Like, so, like, your, I don't know, your starter deck Ironhide is a 13 right there. Like, just.
Yeah.
Does it matter who he was and, like, whatever? Like, I mean, 13 is going to take out most other characters at their cost,
right?
Or put a huge hurting on them otherwise. So I think that's part of, like, another reason why I wanted to do this, was to try to figure out, like, if there was a way to define why that mattered. Like,
right.
That why do the wide decks have that advantage? Like, and again, this comes into, and there's other articles to write about this, but, like, if you didn't need to play that battle card, wait for another opportunity to play it, because you're just going to be in an overkill situation, things like that, etc.
Yes.
So, like, this comes into, like, the perfect play aspect as well, but, like, there has to be a reason now why one sphere dominates another, and I know that's the part of this that kind of got left out, but, like, and has to be defined, but, like,
well, I think it's an individual show / article or both for each relationship, because there's a lot of things that go into, even, I don't want to make it sound simple, but the simplest one to me, at least, is 3 wide versus 4 wide orange decks. And even that, you could go into a lot explaining the turns and how it just breaks down, that barring some intervention, 4 wide's doing its thing. Or wider, I guess.
Yeah, and the real reason is because this game is not about card, and this proves it. This game is not about card advantage.
Mm-hmm.
This game is not about. This game is about attack advantage. The number of attacks that you needs to be less than your opponent to win the game, and that's all that matters.
Absolutely.
So no matter how you get to that, is, like, to me, like, you need to be using all your phases, as I call them, during a turn to their best ability when needed. And sometimes the best thing to do is to not do them and save them for later.
Yes.
So,
and that's a difficult lesson to learn. It's very much, I think, the inherent nature to, I can play 2 cards a turn. I'm going to play 2 cards a turn. Not necessarily appropriate, but for exactly the reasons you outlined, that it's a matter of decreasing the clock required to close the game out in the best way possible. And it's not quite always that simple as just follow this rote script.
It almost never is.
Exactly.
But you have to understand why it may or may not have been the right call at the time, I guess. But I feel like that's only going to get more complicated as we get more cards. I feel like the script aspect was much easier during Wave 1 than it is now.
Yes. Well, I mean, by definition, a smaller card pool, a smaller set of interactions. I mean, we've grown with not just the card pool, but the meta and the understanding, because of things like what you're putting together here, Scott, that now people understand, or hopefully understand, the need for things like direct damage. To your earlier point of shrinking the number of turns required because you can get something out of combat, or even more obvious dealing with that scrapnel that's going to sit there for 100 turns.
Yeah. And I guess, and no one said this, but I guess, it only makes sense for me to challenge myself. Like, could there be more spheres? I guess, like, you could say that, the 4-wide aggro Autobot decks do not operate like an Insecticon deck. I would argue they have the same strengths and weaknesses outside of certain interactions, again, like RC, and
right.
That's pretty much the main one. But, like, the point is that, like, you're making your 3-wide opponent attack where you want them to because you have an extra character, and you're saving your most important character on the first round to do its job.
Right.
And that's not any different than the way that Insecticons operates by sending in usually Barrage as its last character. They're not sending in Ransack as their last character. They're not sending in Shrapnel as their last character unless they have to, So I understand that there's some... You could argue that, like, the spheres don't always operate exactly the same, but I would challenge you to really play a lot of games and tell me if, like... I want somebody to explain to me, like, why that would be the case,
right?
And why there should be, like, a third way of looking at, like, a third axis to think about for some reason.
Well, I think that as we get more cards, as things evolve, the relationships are going to inherently change, or if there's a play pattern for a given matchup that... And I can't think of a good example, and this one isn't great. Say Cars, if they find an untap effect, they function as, air quotes, a 4-wide orange-ish deck. And then that can change the relationship with other matchups potentially. But that is really one of the things that you called out earlier of it's one of the pivotal things for a given build. It defines it, and therefore that's how the whole deck operates. So... Like I said, maybe not necessarily the best example.
No, but I think what you're saying, and where I think we agree, is that I don't think that the tribe or the faction matters. Other than potential strengths and weaknesses of certain cards they have access to that will just make them as more powerful esoteric decks in themselves, but it doesn't necessarily change a bad matchup into a good one.
Yeah, it would have to be a unique effect. So that's why I was calling out Cars, because it changes you into, again, a pseudo 4-wide as compared to, say, Dino Chomp, which you do Dinobot things better, but that doesn't change that you're still operating as a Dinobot deck.
Right, but the issue is, and this is back in... I'll just give a Wave 1 example, because I ran a lot of Cars during Wave 1. The problem was, if you're going up against a control deck that has armor, and again, this was during Wave 1, so armor actually stuck.
Yeah, what a novel concept.
Yeah, but we'll just call it a consistently defensive deck. So for whatever way the deck is consistently defensive, in Wave 1, it was armor, but even now it could just be heavy blue deck. We'll just call it, for example, an inborn high defense or inborn high tough or something like that. We'll just say.
Yep.
No matter how many times you attack, they're still defending for 6 or 7 every single time. So if you're a Cars deck that's attacking more times, but for less damage, your matchup is still bad.
Yeah, you're not truly the other sphere.
Right. Whereas, like, if you're now suddenly, your characters are like Wheeljack, General Optimus, and RC, let's just say, all these characters that are really good against control decks.
Yep.
Now all of a sudden you're changing that matchup, but you're still a 3-wide aggro deck, and now you're probably way worse against, like, 4-wide aggro decks.
Right.
But you solved your other problem. So this is the back and forth that goes on, and why you have to figure out within that sphere where you want to be positioned. It's likely you may be able to improve, in my opinion. And this is why I like the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock instead of just rock, paper, scissors. Like, you may be able to improve one of your bad matchups, but I find it I can't imagine you can improve both without other spokes suffering.
Right.
And that's why in the Rock Paper Scissors Lizard Spock, where there's every one of them has two bad, two things, it loses to two things. That's why I think like that is a true representation of what's going on here, even though there's like whatever 12. But I think that's a much better representation because I don't think you can solve both things ever without the other things suffering.
And that may
or without becoming a whole new deck, a whole new sphere. I think at that point, I don't know.
Right. There's that, or there's an egregious issue with the card pool. I guess is the other potential thing where it's like, oh, well, all of a sudden, 3 wide blue decks just crush everything, and they have no weaknesses. Well, that's probably an issue as a whole, which thankfully we're hopefully going to avoid.
Yeah, and I can use former meta examples to explain this best, just because I don't think that this meta has been fleshed out enough to necessarily use.
Oh, absolutely not.
The current meta, but like the reason why certain decks dominated at certain times in past metas, honestly, was because the other spheres weren't popular. Not because they overcame the weakness. I truly believe it's just because there was no deck in the spheres that was weak to that were popular or even being used. So like if you think back at Wave 1 so at the end of Wave 1, when the 3 wide Optimus decks, and I guess you could say during Wave 2 also, were doing really well, it's because there was no 3 wide aggro deck it would still lose to Dinobots. It would still lose to Cars, but those decks just weren't as popular.
Right.
So seemingly, quote, it was dominating, but it really wasn't dominating. It just didn't run into its bad matchups. And this is, I guess, the other reason I subconsciously made this is because I was tired of hearing about people saying that XYZ card was broken or XYZ card needs to be banned. And things like that.
There are those discussions.
So it's like, what they don't understand is like, you could just go play this and you'd be fine. Now you'll lose to all these other things. The reason why this deck became popular, probably, like, again, like, assuming it, that's what would happen, but you may be able to find something in the middle or some way, especially with sideboarding, to fix that.
Yep.
But I guess that might be a subconscious other reason why.
I think I think that's a very valid one. It's important to bring up that there isn't, and again, this is not to beat the point to death, but I think subconsciously, whether people want to admit it or not, there's probably a level of the same thing I suffer from where it's, no, I want to play this, and it doesn't do well against that. So therefore, that other thing is a problem, and it needs to go, as opposed to you need to adjust yourself. That's what you have control over. You can decide what decks you play and how you play them. If something is kicking your butt up and down the street, probably don't run face first into the wood chipper with the same thing over and over again, because you're going to get the same result.
Yeah. And again, but again, if you as a player not just love the deck, but like understand that, like, the reason you love the deck is because you're better with it, because like you can see the plays better than, like your playtesting partner that's just running the deck, like play the game differently, and so that affects a matchup in a certain way. Like I remember we were testing like Wave 2, for example, and we discovered, for example, that like the problem with aerial bots against Dinobots was not Grimlock. The problem was Sludge, for example, because the healing was like a big deal.
Yeah.
And so Sludge actually became the number one target when you're playing aerial bots than Grimlock. And that makes no sense to, like, if you've never played it.
Yeah, somebody watches you do that, they're going to wonder what's wrong with you, for the most part.
Right. And because the way aerial bots operated, you want to concentrate all your firepower on the Superstar Destroyer and take it out.
Yep.
And against, no matter what you were playing against, that you always had to identify what the target was and go after it. And here you went after what seemingly was the quote wrong target. But if you really knew aerial bots and you knew that this was a bad matchup for you. If they swung with Sludge early, then all of a sudden your window of killing him is wide open.
Yep, for sure.
Whereas, because they're like, I'm going to save for this Grimlock attack, where I'm going to attack 50. It's like, so you're going to take out 2 of my planes just like you were going to take out 2 of my planes anyway. Like, it didn't matter.
Right.
Or you weren't. Most of the time, you just weren't. You weren't going to be able to take out 2 planes no matter what you did anyway.
Yeah. It helps when you defend for like 1,000.
Right. So the better play as a Dinobot player would have been to save Sludge to allow your other guys to heal more often. But again, like as the Aerobot player, if you knew that and your opponent didn't, you're now changing the dynamic of that matchup.
Right.
So that's where, like, to me, the play skill, the experience, the intimacy that you have with the deck can help you a lot, even if you want to treat it as your own pet deck and you feel like it, like, oh, this deck no longer has a place in the meta because of XYZ reason. Well, I'm going to run it into the ground. Like, there's plenty of players, and it's really mostly in other card games, because that's all I have to rely on, that, like, would run. They were the only player that could run their deck, and then somebody else would pick it up and be like, what the hell is this pile of trash? And, like, get thrashed with it. Like,
right.
But they knew it inside and out. And a lot of times, like, that deck didn't even change, like, for years. Like, they would run it again, like, when the format would rotate back to whatever that deck was legally, and they'd play it again, and, like,
Yep.
it was good again, like, so that can happen. And that's not even just play skill. That's like, that's like a different level. I don't even know what that's like.
Yeah, they become one with their build. I guess
yeah.
there is a level beyond just being good at that stage with a given deck.
Yeah, because there's definitely been conversations that it's like, that person's good with that deck and they always run that deck. And it's like, okay, like, whatever. Like, I can't run that deck, but, that's more power to them,
Yeah, that's something that would exist somewhere well off of the graph, because how do you account for something like that?
Yeah. So, but I wanted to eliminate all that stuff as best as possible, was my point.
Exactly, because that's not an appropriate starting point, as we had said earlier, that you can't account for that level of prowess with a given thing. And if that's the bar, you can't assume that everybody's going to be at that level with a given thing. So, what if you sit down across from that person? Them's the breaks, I guess. There's only so much you can do.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like I don't even think we've even reached a point where there's, like, I mean, I prefer to play certain decks, but it doesn't mean, like, I have to play that style of deck. And I think, like, I don't think we're at a point yet where you can isolate yourself to that point either.
No,
it's only to your own detriment. So.
I mean, we're talking about people that have played a deck for multiple years, plural. We haven't quite even. We don't have that many notches on our belt for this yet. This game.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Questions I can answer? Are there questions you have I can answer about it? Or?
Well, I was about to say, was there anything you wanted to throw in? Because I think we covered a lot of the initial layers of this. We're clearly going to be revisiting it as we evaluate other decks, or, one of the things I'm picturing down the line is, as more store results come in or other large events, we're going to get the lists, we're going to look at them and say, well, that's weird. Why did they run X? Does that then change, referencing back to this diagram, does that then flip one of these arrows? Does that position it in a different way compared to what we were expecting going in? And I think that's how we can probably reference this tool, at least on this show, going forward. One of the more obvious ways to reference it going forward, anyway.
The results I've seen are, now, I don't want to, how do I say this? of the decks I've seen that I would agree with most of the build that's there.
Uh-huh.
I would say that what I've seen results-wise, the theory has held up, but we're only seeing results mostly from, like, singular events where it was like, if you lost in the top 32 to one matchup, like, that's not really a sample set. But, like,
Yeah.
And at least I understood why. But at the same time, like when on the flip side, when I know that a deck that should have won from a sphere perspective lost, and I see the deck list, I can see why it lost. If that makes sense.
Well, it calls back to our earlier point about, are they skewing themselves in a direction to try and accomplish something that you're really stretching for, or is it just something they got very creative with the deck list, we'll say.
I'm not sure they even knew that such a thing was even. I don't even think people always even thought that such a thing was even possible. Like this is where a lot of like the ranged package conversation can come into play and things like that. Like
Mm.
like if you're running some kind of control deck and you're not running range right now, you're probably doing something because
Yeah.
that's why you're good against the aggro decks, like the
Right.
wide aggro decks. Like so, if you're not doing that, like if you didn't take the lesson from seeing aerial bots and try to apply that to your control strategies, like that was the reason why they were winning, not because they had 5 characters, it's because they were attacking on a different axis. And as best as you can adopt that axis to your own control strategy, which is where 3-Wide Optimus, for example, came into play. Like if you weren't applying that to your other control strategies and you lost to wide aggro, that's the reason why, not because the sphere argument was wrong.
Right.
If that makes sense.
I mean, barring, I guess, obviously intense variance, we'll call it, or, something of outside of normal vectors. There are clearly other factors where, if, as we said, play skill makes a huge difference. If there were major play errors made, sort of thing, you can't really account for that on paper in advance. You have to account for that in the lab, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I hope this. I also like this because I think it can help people build decks differently.
It's definitely influenced my own. Again, it's you're focusing what your changes are. It's not just I'm trying random configurations and throwing it against Insecticons a billion times, because your base assumptions are still in favor of bugs, I guess is the best way to put it. Like if you're playing a losing matchup into it, are the changes you're making trying to effect actual change in the results in that direction? If not, well, you're just bashing your head against the wall.
Yeah, and it's probably more effective to try to answer that through a sideboard.
Correct.
Which is a whole nother discussion, which I mentioned. I think is caveat 1 or 3. I don't remember, but but that it's possible to address it that way. And obviously, we're still really at the infancy of that compared
Absolutely.
to how long we've been playing the game in general. So I think that's another factor to take into consideration.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Scott. It's a very generic question, but are there any points that we can look forward to? Obviously, you're going to circle back to this topic, but is there anything that you wanted to highlight that didn't quite make it into your first 2 articles for this?
Like I said, I guess the explanation of why the arrows point the way they do, and understanding, why certain strategies beat other ones, is probably the biggest one. And I guess understanding the whole point of, I think I didn't spend a lot of time on the quote, like win your sphere part.
Okay.
But I guess I think the point I made, and I'll stress again, is the goal of that is basically to cut this meta down to whatever 8 decks to run against, because running it against 20 is just impossible.
Right.
So if you're willing to say that deck A is a stand-in for decks A through E, then at least you're saving yourself having to playtest the.
Makes sense.
But it doesn't mean that, like, I guess that's a way that, like, this could be proven wrong. excuse me, if that doesn't hold true.
Well, I think that's going to be contingent on, and I agree with you that is a way to try and identify holes, but I don't necessarily, or I wouldn't phrase it as it's an wrong or incorrect. It's just evolving. So that's where I was going earlier with the cars example of, do the individual things, the individual cards available to us, cause this particular shift? Whereas as a whole, just because it's, a ranged card, it's a melee card, it's a car card, it's a whatever card. So that particular build within that sphere becomes unique, and therefore it shifts it on the tier list within that sphere, as opposed to it either creates an entirely new sphere or completely turns the theory on its head. Because I think there's always going to be, and that's why I'm struggling a little bit with how to explain it, but for anybody out there listening, it's the general idea of this theory, I feel, is very sound. But like anything else, you can poke holes in it if you dive deep enough into the details to find just the one contrary example. And it's worth finding those to determine whether you need to reevaluate everything, or is it a unique facet of the given card pool, the given deck structure, the particular interaction, because only this character and this card allow you to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I gave the examples of decks I've created specifically to try to break these cycles.
Mm.
And they wound up either creating their own spheres or changing the matchups within them. I guess the only other thing I would say, I put a lot of my deck lists out there, and there's others that you might see. The reason why my deck lists tend to look so much different than other people's, like examples being like, you tend to see a lot of other aggro decks leaning heavily on like the heavy bold strategies of like supercharge, power punch, and like I typically don't run these cards. I run the static buffs, like static laser Ironhide and other, never leave home without my reckless charges, things like that.
Right.
It's a lot of my deck construction comes from this theory, and I needed to define in my own head, why do my decks look different? And I think it's because instead of running, I tend to run more blanks or off-color cards than a lot of other players do when I see other lists, and it's because I feel like I need those cards to assist me in these bad matchups or help my good matchups, instead of just, I flipped another orange and I do +1 more damage. Or I flipped another blue and I do +1 more defense. And I'm going to play a less powerful card to help me define this theory and stick to this, because I just feel like, so I think that's probably another reason, like my decks just look different than other players, if that makes sense.
I follow you. And I think that is pretty clear. One of, maybe not the only reason, but one of the clear definers of why you end up where you do for deck lists, like you said, compared to other people. I guess moving from there, is there anything else you wanted to bring up about the spheres theory, at least at this point in time? I did want to call out, just partially for the laughs, but Metroplex being off on its own thing. We will probably need to explore that particular sphere more, because now there's going to be another Titan. I've seen some Optimus Prime Battlefield Legends solo lists with like 1 billion stars. I think we're going to probably just have the Titans in that sphere, but it's one that'll probably have to get elaborated on going forward.
Yeah, like I mentioned in talking to you and other people that have run it, the deck fights against itself more than it fights against other decks, although it does have strengths and weaknesses against certain other decks just by nature of like it having 35 health or whatever. But most of the Metroplex power comes in from the tap. So
of course.
If you hit it, you're good. If you miss it, you just lose. So
that's kind of how it works.
And the Triptychon thing, at least on paper, looks to be similar to where it's going to be like if all your deployment green cards are stuck at the bottom of your deck for some reason,
That
it's probably going to be a bad time.
Yeah, you may have a bad day if that works out that way.
So, I mean, it shouldn't, but like the games that it does, it's going to feel real bad. So, like, just like not hitting your Metroplex ability, like if you build the Metroplex deck to not hit the ability, like, like it seems incorrect to me, but
I mean, hey, I tried it way back in Wave 1 where it was like, hey, we got 35 health, let's make a blue deck with it. It didn't work then, but maybe somebody, some intrepid deck builder out there can figure it out.
Mm-hmm. But, that's just like, I like that deck just seems to fight against itself more than it does against other strategies, although certain other strategies will give it more time to fix its own weaknesses, let's put it that way.
For sure. Yeah, it definitely has things it would prefer to see as opposed to ones that it would try to avoid. But I agree, it is definitely very weird compared to, as you said earlier, if the assumption is 3 wide decks of varying flavors are the norm, when you end up getting to whether it's Constructicons or Metroplex, when you get to that end, things start to get weird.
Yeah.
Although I guess...
And there's reasons for it.
Yes.
I think that's what people need to understand, is that there's reasons for it. Like,
absolutely.
Attacking Metroplex 5 times for insignificant points of damage is really just giving them access to go get more backup beams or whatever, to go get more bold, like get more green cards. That's all you're really doing.
Absolutely.
So, I think that's where some of this... I think that's... The under the surface stuff is probably one way that I do. One thing that I think, you need to understand, I wasn't able to go into, is, again, this is part of the why. There's reasons for this, and that's like a pure example that people just don't think about. Like, when my Firefly is attacking Metroplex, I'm just giving him access to more green cards.
Yep. So, yeah, it makes things certainly challenging if you're fighting into the big city bot. So we all look forward to your 2 tall orange deck, Scott, since that seems to be the sphere that's missing. So we'll wait for all your tournament and meta buster in that build pretty soon. Any other thoughts on spheres, at least at this stage? Obviously, it's a very large topic, and things are still in flux and being evaluated as we're evolving the Siege 1 meta.
Yeah, like any theory, it's up for debate, so I'm willing to discuss it with anybody. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. I think that kind of does it for us, Scott. Despite our earlier technical difficulties, we still managed to go roughly 2 hours.
Well, if we cut all that out, maybe we'll only have one podcast.
Yeah, I think this will definitely be a slightly longer but singular podcast, I think. So without anything else to add, at least on my part, anything else for you, Scott? Or anything else coming up Vector Sigma-wise that you want to call out?
Energon Qualifier we're going to this weekend. Again, check out the Patreon if you need assistance with your own Energon Qualifiers. We're always taking on coachees and such, and I think if you want some proof of concept, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with some of the coachees and find out what their feedback has been. Otherwise, for the next month, going to try to hit as many of it looks like all of September, you could probably hit one almost every single week. I don't think I'll be hitting them every single week, but as best as possible, we'll be out there representing. And then I'm hoping that in the next couple weeks, we'll start to get more Siege 2 spoilers, so we can start our long testing season for the Invitational. Yeah,
there's definitely going to be a very interesting testing season for that, but that's
Unicron was extended until October, I saw.
I was going to bring that up at the beginning, and I totally forgot. I'm even looking at Unicron did get extended. I'm still not going in on it, but I am happy, and I hope that they do make it. Like, I do want to see one, like, in person. I don't know if I can really swing owning one.
You see the little Galvatron figure?
Yeah, that was pretty cool. They like all the photos of him devouring Galvatron. That's hysterical. It was a good touch, and I saw somebody tweet this out. I agree. I wish they had said that earlier, because as silly as it is, I feel like that would have gotten people more hyped about it. It may have not been consciously the tipping point, but it's one of those things that's like, oh, that's really cool. All right, maybe I'll think about this.
Yeah, I saw the guy like transforming it in like double time, and it was still taking forever. So
Oh my
that was
God.
fun.
So one thing, okay, I don't want to make this too much longer, but one thing that I saw somebody, he's over a foot deep.
Mhm.
Regular DTOFs are only about 11 inches deep. So, or at least the whatever IKEA model the person was referring to, which I thought was very interesting because just simple storage for this guy is going to be a challenge. Plus, he weighs
hang it.
he weighs like he weighs like 20 pounds. Where are you going to hang it from?
I don't know.
You got to find an actual beam in your house to make sure you hang it from with a real chain.
I'm hoping
Anyway,
over the next month. One thing I hope over the next month is that they make the yellow more like the, I don't know, orangey yellow from the movie.
yeah. Well, I think all these are prototypes, so I'm sure they'll color match it closer, like once things are more set in stone.
Yeah.
But
Throw it
yeah,
out there.
I'm excited, and I don't know. I know it's not going to happen, but I wish that was the still unknown toy for the Energon Invitational. But
I don't think it won't be ready for like 2 years. I don't think.
oh yeah, for sure, and it would probably never have because I don't remember what place that goes out to. Like, I don't think it's just the winner. I want to say it's like top 16 or something.
Top 8 or top 16.
Yeah, even then, that's a pretty hefty price tag on top of everything else. So, and I can't imagine shipping it.
I saw a cool toy Siege commercial too.
They're coming out with a lot more of those. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Thought they were neat.
Yeah, they're doing. I'm getting pretty hyped about Siege 2 on a number of fronts.
I went to a different Target today, and they had more toys.
Nice. Yeah, ours. A lot of the Walmarts here are flush with shockwaves, which I was surprised by. But they're flush with shockwaves.
We're way off topic, but just throw it out there.
It's Transformers, it counts. But anyway, we will wrap it up. So, as always, folks, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and please tune in next time for more Tech Talk.
Hey guys, Dan here from VectorSigma.info. We wanted to take this moment to thank all of our patrons for believing in the service we're providing. If you're not yet a member of a Patreon, feel free to click on the link for other podcasts like this one, or verse videos, or any of the other great content that we provide on our YouTube channel. Thanks, guys.